What would accessibility look like in a fantasy world? Maybe not so different from the real world. Welcome to Gaining Advantage. Welcome to Gaining Advantage. We're using role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons to help you make lives better. If you haven't heard or backed it yet, there's just a few more days as this is getting posted. Maybe in your case, by the time you're hearing this, a few more minutes to get in on Limitless Heroics, including characters with disabilities, mental illness, and neurodivergence in 5th edition. It ends Thursday morning, my time, which is Central United States. So if you want to get in there before that, you need to go right now. Limitless Heroics will include D&D 5th edition game mechanics for over 450 traits, over 100 new assistive magic items, real-world examples of each one of those so that players can learn more and better represent the symptoms, all kinds of extra help and information about accessibility. I have been talking to therapists and accessibility advocates from different countries, getting their perspectives. This whole thing is getting bigger and better throughout the campaign. It's just really amazing. It's been such an amazing experience to go through this. I've learned so much just during the campaign from talking to people, and that's what it's all about. And I want to share that with you. So we hit the service animals stretch goal, which I know a lot of people are excited about. So you can jump over to inclusiverpg.com and that'll give you all the details. We just hired 2 more sensitivity consultants. They're psychologists from the Geek Therapeutics Network who are really excited about this project too. And if you go to the Kickstarter page, make sure that you scroll down and read through the staff bios because we have an amazing team. And everyone that was hired for this project is disabled, neurodivergent, mentally ill, or a combination of those. And when the main manuscript is ready, we just announced this to our backers. We're sending it out to our backers to get feedback from people's real-world experiences and their playtest thoughts. And so we started this by talking to dozens of people about their experiences. But now it'll be potentially thousands. I'm so excited about connecting with our backers and that are represented by this project and hearing their experiences and then communicating that through the role-playing experience. So make sure you don't miss it. Go to inclusiverpg.com right now. And now let's get to our interview. Whether you're writing a novel or a role-playing game, it helps to get an outside perspective to make sure that what you're writing isn't harmful. Today, we welcome someone who provides that extra perspective, accessibility advocate, Fay Onyx. Welcome, Fay.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about disability today.
All right, so tell us a little bit about yourself, especially your work with tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah, so um, I'm a disability advocate and consultant who specializes in tabletop role-playing games and speculative fiction storytelling. Also, I kind of wear a lot of hats. So I'm a game designer, I'm a podcaster with my podcast. Doing a tabletop role-playing game actual play. Um, I'm artist, writer. I probably am forgetting some other stuff that I do too, because it's a lot of stuff that's kind of all tied together.
So, in your work as an accessibility advocate, you've written quite a few articles about disability representation. So, how did that start and has it grown over time?
Yeah, well, it actually started with tabletop role-playing games, and then also my writing. So at the time, I was doing a lot of writing fantasy, well, fairy tale stories with diverse representation. Um, and I was putting that in my podcast, writing Alchemy, and reading them, sound effects, and all of that. And so I had in this one area of my life where I was working on disability representation. And then in this other area of my life, tabletop role playing games, where I really enjoy play table. I really enjoy playing tabletop role playing games, but I was realizing I wasn't making any disabled characters or very few disabled characters in my games. And I was wondering why, in one area of my life, I was really enjoying making diverse representation and why I wasn't in tabletop role-playing games. And I realized it was kind of this combination of how the game systems themselves handle disability, kind of combined with the sorts of stories that a lot of game systems are designed to tell, which tend to be very combat heavy. And if I'm thinking about, especially about making a character that's based on me, so like someone with anxiety, someone with a chronic back condition, things like that. Um, a character, especially a character that had both of those, would probably be very unlikely to get into combat situations, um, or at least would do their best to stay out of them. There's kind of that combination of the focus on combat, and then also there's this issue that although we're seeing increasing numbers of disabled characters being represented, still the vast majority of the disabled characters have at least one negative storytelling pattern happening. Even in situations where overall the representation is pretty good, there's still at least one or two negative patterns that are usually still happening, because very few disabled characters are actually written by disabled creators. So that whole combination was happening. And so then I decided to start doing actual plays on my podcast where I have disabled participants, so both game masters and storytellers, and also participants, all of whom are disabled and playing disabled characters as a way of kind of creating more diverse, authentic disability representation than I could do just myself. And that sort of really took off. But I wanted to create some supporting, documents of like, here's some information for new participants. And I just couldn't find the sort of articles I wanted. And there was just like, or, like either there wasn't an article on a topic, but I'd sort of heard disabled people talking about it, but there was no one who'd written it up for everybody to like understand the issue. Or there were articles, but the articles were really focused on what's the negative pattern, but there wasn't a what to do instead component. And so I started writing my own. So that started with the Trope of the Week series, which has now been renamed Ableist Tropes and Storytelling. And it kind of went from there. I started a series of articles about disability representation specifically in tabletop role playing games, because that is something I'm very passionate about. I got one of my more popular articles from that. I got connected to the folks at Mythkrants, which do a blog about speculative fiction writing, who I've been collaborating with, and they do amazing amounts of editing and refining for the articles. And so I wrote my Ridding Your Monsters of Ableism article, which is apparently their number one article for last year. And their blog gets a lot of traffic. So I'm like, wow. I'm
It's a great
really
article.
excited. Thank you. And I'm really excited, that I'm seeing these gaps and I'm filling them. And there's a need out there. Like the fact that it's the number one article shows, like, you can get disabled people commenting here and there about ableist monsters, but no one had that I could find in English anyway, written up an article on here's what happens when people create monsters for things like role-playing games, and you get the hunchbacked monster or you get the low intelligence monster, and no one really thinks about how ableist that is. And so it kind of just grew from there. I now have a once a month Q&A that I do on the Mythcreant blog about disability specifically. So it kind of just kept growing, and every time I find a gap, I kind of just try to make a resource. I think the most recent one that was a big gap I noticed was collecting resources on a list of Decolonizing Games Resource List is what I think titled it. And that's basically like, a year and a half ago, there was a lot of talk about, anti-Blackness and all that stuff. And I was just like, I realized that you couldn't find articles about this, even though I'd run across all these articles, but you couldn't find them by searching Decolonizing Games, or not find very many. And I'm like, oh, yeah. And I guess if you don't really know what Decolonizing Games is, you don't know to search for anti-Blackness and appropriation and, you know, violence and, you know, all of these different pieces. And so I started pulling that resource together. So I guess it kind of keeps growing, but I've got more articles in the works with the myth grants that are, it's a slow process, but I'm really excited to keep going with this.
That's great. I know when I first got started in all this, your stuff was some of the first stuff I came across, um, and and uh, and and part of that, like you said, was because there really wasn't much out there. So you filled a huge gap, and I also, it's funny you mentioned that that monsters article. Um, I know I've read that article at least twice because I've read it, and then I was looking for something, and that showed up in the search or whatever, and I read it again. This sounds familiar. Oh yeah, you know, but it was something that was, it was worth reading a few times, and I kind of keep referring back to it. So yeah,
Well, that's
no,
great to
absolutely.
hear.
Well, it's just, I mean, there's such a need, like you said, I've talked to so many people that, and really that's in so many ways how I got started in all this, is that that I looked around and there was just so little out there. It just, I couldn't believe what a huge gap there was.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, what year is it? Of course, it was
Right.
2020 at the time, so you know everything's out the window then. But no, it was you know, there is still is a huge gap, but I think you know, your work and the work of others are it's starting to happen and
Yeah,
is gaining momentum. So it's exciting.
it is very exciting to see it growing. Absolutely.
All right. So, what are some common problems with disability representation in role playing games that you frequently come across?
So, yeah, so one of the big problems that I come across a lot that I'm hoping to write an article about at some point, though I do have a lot of articles I'm sort of working on already, is what I call the accommodations fail. And so that's something that comes up basically. I notice it a lot in actual plays, like especially if I'm listening to like an actual play podcast, I'll notice this come up if someone has a disabled character. And a lot of times what happens is that, you know, you have this disabled character, let's say they have a mobility disability, and a situation comes up where they're not able to participate in something. So let's say the group goes off and does a chase scene after some mysterious villain that's been following them or something. And this character with mobility disability basically is like, well, I can't keep up with this chase scene. And they basically just chill there doing nothing
Hmm.
while the rest of the group goes off. And, you know, so there's clearly an accessibility barrier there, right? But afterwards, it's just like everyone kind of just seems like they think that's what disability is. You have this situation where someone can't participate, and that's disability. And it's like, I want to pull my hair out. I'm like, that's an accessibility barrier. You know, they come up sometimes when you don't expect them. That's life. But you don't just shrug your shoulders and say, that's disability. You say, okay, let's talk about accommodations. Let's talk about tools. Let's talk about group behaviors. Let's talk about, you know, getting something to increase this person's mobility. Let's talk about assistive devices. This is, you know, we've identified the barrier, now we should do something about it, not just shrug our shoulders and be like, I guess that's what disability is. um, and it just feels like this fundamental, like, this is what disability activism is all about, is identifying, like, we have these barriers and it's not just the person's fault and they're the disabled person, and that's how what disability means. Like, there's social things that could be done if this person had a mount, you know, if it's more of a fantasy setting, or a chariot, or like Or if the group behaved differently, right? So they, spent some time researching magical tracking methods. So now we don't have to chase after the person, but we can tag them, go to their hideout later as a group and do an infiltration mission that doesn't require running around or whatever the thing is. There's so many options, but it just makes my heart ache because that's exactly in real life. It's not just, oh, I guess disabled people can't do this thing. It's like, no, there's a barrier, and that barrier is partially created by the social structure that's happening, and we can change that. So that's a big one that I run across a lot. And in terms of game systems, that's also like if there aren't if the rules don't have assistive devices in it, if they don't have discussions of these issues, people don't know, right? And I think the other big one I'd really like to talk about at this point is also what I call the unintentionally disabled character, which I think people are becoming more aware of disability and wanting to represent that respectfully. And I think this is one area where we get really terrible representation because it's unintentional. And so this usually comes up in role playing games where you have especially like character stats that are taken to extremes. And usually it's taken low. So the classic one is low intelligence. This is where we get some profoundly ableist stuff coming up, and people don't know they're being ableist, right? This may be someone who wants to represent disabled people well and respectfully, but for some reason, they're just tanking their character's intelligence, and and then they're playing an unintelligent character and not realizing that anytime you take a stat to a low extreme, where it's altering how they live their life and interfering with daily tasks and their ability to fully participate in things, you've created a disability. And probably it's very similar to real world disabilities. So, what it would be identified as a low intelligence character is a character with a cognitive disability, a learning disability, something in that family of disabilities. And if you don't know you've created a disabled character, the unconscious ableism that we've all been taught comes out. And so people start portraying profoundly negative stereotypes of what it means
Mhm.
to have a learning, developmental, cognitive disability. And that all just comes out, and people have no idea they're even doing it.
Yep.
So this is something I'm working on an article on. So hopefully, eventually, I'll be able to publish this. But I don't want to wait till the article comes out to talk about it because I think
Yeah.
it's a big area that have identified where people who want to make respectful representation aren't. So,
No,
um,
absolutely. And that's wow, that is in every form of media. Um, it's everywhere. And it's so accepted.
Right. Right. And it's not just low intelligence. I mean, intelligence itself, you could pick apart. That itself is an ableist concept. Not that there aren't specific cognitive skills that people can be brilliant at, or struggle with, but lumping them all together in some we don't even think of as cognitive abilities, even though they are, and we don't really value them. And then some we value, and we create this idea of intelligence, and there's class in that, and there's race in that, and there's gender all up in there. So, but also, like, if you have a character that's super low strength, at a certain point, again, you've created someone with some sort of physical disability. If you have someone who's extremely clumsy, at a certain point, that becomes some sort of motor coordination disability, right?
Mhm.
So you take anything to an extremely low point, people play really low charisma characters, often as very socially awkward. And at a certain point, it starts representing stereotypes, often stereotypes about autism.
Mhm.
Um, so you take pretty much anything to an extreme and you get that.
And so what are some positive impacts you've seen come out of your work?
Yeah, so I definitely have heard people say that my articles have helped them. And I've even had some folks are starting to translate some of them into French, which is incredibly flattering and also very exciting. Um, and so, I hear some feedback about that, but I don't necessarily always hear about all of the ways it kind of trickles out to other people's lives. But I get the most feedback, I think, about my podcast because that's like representation of disabled characters by disabled people, which is still sadly rare. And people really say how much it means to them. And I think it really speaks to how important representation is. And even just in a fantasy world, doing accessibility right, or as right as we can get, it's always a growing process. There's always going to be mistakes and places to learn, but doing it right in the sense of we're centering it, we're being respectful. If we make a mistake, we address it honestly and openly. Um, doing all of that makes such a difference. It creates a place of, I think, rest and recuperation for our minds and hearts. And I think it also helps strengthen us and also helps, like, art is where new ideas come from. Even if it's in a very fantastical setting, we can just thinking about and experiencing a fantasy world where there's accessibility built into the world, that all on its own changes how we think about things. And I think one of the most absolutely flattering things someone has ever said to me was that if they could get into the Adventurers Academy by burning their Hogwarts letter, they'd do it. Um, or something to that effect. It was like, I burned my Hogwarts letter to get into the Adventurers Academy. And um, and the Adventures Academy is something out of my podcast, where it's basically a healthy learning environment that's a magical school.
Ah,
And I did take it to more of a college level sort of school, because then you can have risk. Because, in college, you do chemistry lab, right? There's real risks in college,
mhm,
but their safety procedures are taught to people.
hmm.
But hey, if you're teaching someone to be an adventurer, the risks might be higher. So the goal is to make the academy itself very exciting and magical and make the education the challenges and not have bullying and not have casually unsafe learning environments where risks that really should be eliminated are there or aren't addressed effectively. But also, especially that sort of toxicity of all the drama around bullies and that sort of stuff. And also, it's a school that really, like, the creators of the school were disabled people, so they really centered disability, um, and the education and how they're training disabled people to be adventurers. And so I think it just speaks to how important even imagining an environment like that is.
Yeah. We were actually just having, I'm so glad you brought this up. We were having a conversation about this on our company Discord. And, and we're talking about, okay, so if you had a magical setting, we talk about accessibility and, and like what you could do with magic and stuff.
Mhm.
And, and so like, imagine how much better the world would be. And at first it's like, well, okay, but would it really? Because look at the technology that we have today, um, and how little is often done when they could do something, but they don't. But then, but at the same time, this is a fantasy setting, and so how about we take those ideas and go, okay, how could it be better? And then use that to imagine a better real world
Yeah,
to model
absolutely.
it and go, well, if you could do this in this setting, there's a modern analog to that we could implement.
Right. And some of the things are things we can do, which is like, for example, thinking about, being inclusive of deaf people, that just shapes how you arrange tables. And of course, there's actually like a whole um, deaf space architectural movement as well that has a lot more to it in terms of design. But they're all things that like, or the vast majority of them are things that benefit everyone and are things that would increase accessibility for other people as well. And having, spaces that are more, where everyone can see everyone, like that creates a better environment for everyone, to have that space, like in a classroom, for example, as opposed to the one person at the front and everyone's backs to each other, you know. Um, so I think there's a lot of that which has been interesting in researching for building the academy. But I really think that is the thing is like I think a lot of people just don't even think about it, or it's an afterthought. They create their design and then they try to tack on disability stuff later. But if even we start imagining, oh, hey, what would this be like? But one of the things I think is really interesting is just thinking about like a fantasy world where you have the body diversity that's there just in the fantasy species and thinking about that and what an accessibility needs does that just inherently create. And it's like, if you have people ranging from 1 foot tall to 8 feet tall, stairs are not the best option.
Yep.
How do you create a set of stairs that's going to match everyone's physical needs? And at that point, the ramp really is the best option. But of course, you also are going to want to have like your elevators too for folks, where a ramp might be harder to walk on, and also for folks who have limited capacity and such. But also, like, you got your mermaids and wheelchairs, because how are they going to get around on land if their tail doesn't magically turn into legs when it dries,
Mhm.
um so it's kind of interesting to kind of notice that body diversity just in a fantasy world, and how often in fantasy and sci-fi you get a staircase when you really do have all of these people of different sizes moving around. And it's like, what does this building have, like a dozen different staircases in front of it, all different like numbers of stairs? um and how it's forgotten, just that body diversity in the fantasy world would demand different accessibility options. And a regular door might be really dangerous for someone 1 foot tall, because like if someone else is just coming through from the other way, the door just like hit them.
Yep.
And like just thinking about those options, some of it matches stuff that real disabled people have, and some of it maybe is different accessibility needs that go beyond what is in the real world. But just thinking about that is something that I found absolutely fascinating, and something that I think a lot of able-bodied like creators completely miss, that this is even an issue that would exist, and that the people that they're imagining in the buildings they're imagining would not be it would not be a good environment for a lot of the people.
Yeah. No, absolutely. All right. So, what one message would you like to give to disabled people?
Well, I think for that, I guess I'm kind of thinking a lot about disabled people wanting to play disabled characters. And I think for that is just, if the game system has rules that don't work for your character's disability, change them, modify them, like don't feel like you have to just accept that. Because, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, there's a lot of line of sight rules for magic. And those are
Mhm.
probably created for certain game purposes. There's nothing about magic that inherently needs a line of sight, but they're trying to limit the scope of the magic in a way that is technically interesting for people who like more technical play. And so they're trying to create some of these things so that stealth is meaningful in the game, for example. Um, but if you have a blind character who's casting magic, like, that kind of creates this weird situation where it's like, oh, there's all these spells they couldn't theoretically use at all. And it's like, well, that's silly. This rule isn't part of reality. This rule or anything that's inherent to the magic, it was created for just this technical aspects of game balance. Um, and, if you want to take that and change it and make it like hearing instead of sight, or make it into a line of effect sort of thing, like you might have to do some thinking, but like it's more important to have a character that is an authentic representation than it is to stick to rules that people made when they weren't even thinking about disability representation. Um, and to not let those messages that, oh, this is just what it means to be disabled, is, if you have a blind character, they just can't do most of the magic. And it's just like, that's not real. That's ableism, not realizing that accommodations are needed, or, that sort of thing.
Right, so in your consulting work with non-disabled people, what is something important that you want them to know?
Yeah. So, I think one of the main things I usually start with a lot of people, um, I mean, a lot of my consulting work is with disabled people who are kind of looking to broaden out their understanding. But when I am working with folks who are non-disabled, um, or doing lectures, or teaching in various forms, um, one of the big things I like to start with is just disability is diverse. And not just that there are a lot of different disabilities that all affect people in different ways, but that each individual disability is diverse. So, just because two people are blind doesn't mean they're having the same experience. A lot of blind people can see to some extent.
Mhm.
There's a lot of stereotypes out there, but also just within each disability, a wide range of experiences, symptoms, triggers for those disabilities that have triggers, different, like from migraine triggers to PTSD triggers. People will have different triggers, like different life experiences, which make the disability have different impacts on their lives, right? Whether or not someone has access to healthcare will have a huge impact on the way the disability operates in their life. And there's just this great deal of um, a diversity, and also diversity of how we experience and think about our disabilities. And whenever you're trying to represent disability, especially like in a game system, or help a disabled player portray a character with um, a disability, would be like particularly significant for this. It's important to have space for that diversity, and to not like dictate what this is the one mechanic all blind characters should use. It's important to. It can be really helpful to have mechanics to start from, but it shouldn't be a one size fits all, because real disability isn't one size fits all. And so it's important to make space for individual people's experiences, and so that they can have an authentic experience with disability, representation within the game.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a question that's come up with me a lot, where people said, "Well, okay, you're talking about how to represent that and stuff like that, but different people have different experiences." Okay, yeah, and so we're making a big point of saying, okay, so we're offering suggestions how you could do that,
Hmm.
but this is not rules is written, handed
Right.
down from Chris Perkins or something, and even he
Right.
says, do it whatever works at your table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I guess the one other thing I'd like to add, which is, don't always focus on the disabled character when you're dealing with disability, right? So we talked a bit about environments, right? Ramps versus stairs. Why does the ancient city need to have stairs everywhere? Why couldn't it have ramps? Right. And then all of a sudden, if you have a character in a wheelchair, now that there's ramps everywhere, that changes their access. And maybe we also have some elevators, and some are working and some aren't, and maybe you have to repair some of them. And it becomes this extra layer to the challenge, right? And that is a different accessibility thing for people for whom stairs would actually be better than a ramp, right? And so there's no reason why the ancient city can't have ramps. Like, question whether the environment needs to be as inaccessible as it is. Think about accessibility for that environment, because disability isn't just about the person, it's also about the social structure and environment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, maybe maybe those ancient cultures were uh, a bit wiser when it came to architecture than say the Romans. Like we think we have to do everything like the Romans. Like they're the be all end
Yeah,
all of ancient architecture.
absolutely. I'm sure plenty of ancient Romans would have appreciated some alternatives to stairs.
Right. Right. So, what projects are you planning for the future that you can talk about?
Oh, yes. So the one that I'm super excited about right now is a podcast project. So, unfortunately, my podcast has been going kind of slow the past 2 years, mostly coinciding with COVID and as someone with anxiety, living in the times of COVID has been very hard for me, and my capacity has gone down, unfortunately. But I am currently releasing um, on my podcast uh, the most recently recorded game, um, which is several years past when I was originally planning to release it, but it's being released. But the next game is one I've actually been working on and planning for years, and it takes place in the Adventurers Academy. So the first game that had the Adventurers Academy in it is called the Owlbear Reintroduction Program. So that was me really working into, kind of leaning into, what does a story that's not centered on violence focus on, and how can we make interesting challenges? And people really loved that and responded to it. And the Adventurers Academy was the starting location, sending people out on their first internship to relocate some owlbears. And then basically, what I'm planning is a longer running game that really focuses on the Adventurers Academy and what education is like there and what the environment is like there, and really trying to make the education itself the fun, exciting thing that's at the center of the game, and also the people and relationships. This is going to be a pretty light game, in but with a lot of heart, and it's going to touch on stuff like trauma, and there's going to be some definite serious stuff in there, but it's going to be overall very light, very fun, very humorous. And I'm gearing up for that, but it's a very long process of populating the academy with a bunch of really awesome, carefully thought out um, teachers and staff people, and creating the physical environment, and kind of doing several rounds of like different types of accessibility. What changes do we need to make it as accessible as possible? Um, but I'm super excited about that, and I honestly can't wait to get it started. And um, I've been working lately on the actual, like, here's the different things they're going to be doing in class, and I'm so excited for it. So that's
Awesome.
kind of a big thing. I'm also working on, as I said, there's some articles and there's some other behind the scenes thing, but that's kind of the big thing I'm gearing up for. That's actually going to be using my own game system, Magic Goes Awry, that I've created and have been working on. And it's used in the Owlbear Reintroduction Program. And it's basically a game system that's got a rules light core mechanic, but very detailed character creation. So the idea is to have character creation with lots and lots of options, and each choice gives a lot of distinct quality to the character and really helps make them distinct and unique. But then the mechanic is rules light, so there's less to keep track of and much less math than D&D. So kind of has that detailed character stuff that people like out of D&D, but trying to strip down to a really rules light mechanic that you don't have to remember 5 different bonuses your character has. sort of thing.
Yeah,
And so that kind of goes along with the Academy adventure because we will be using that game system.
cool. That sounds great. Even as a longtime D&D player, I still like relying on tools like D&D Beyond to do the math for me. Because yeah, it can be, even for me, and I'm pretty good at math. Um, it can be a challenge, and so for people
Yeah.
for whom math is a challenge, or just even remembering all of those various details, and you forgot that bonus or whatever, it can be
Yeah.
pretty frustrating. So it's great to have that alternative.
Yeah, I'm good at keeping track of things, and I'm good at math, and I still forget things when I'm playing D&D or Pathfinder, and I'm like, if I'm not remembering all of this stuff, oh my goodness, what is happening to people who have like dyscalculia? Like,
Hmm.
oh geez,
Yeah,
this is too
yeah,
much.
and I'll tell you that's one of the challenges that we're still working on in our book is how do we because we had to use math to create that granular disabilities of spectrum thing. Um,
Yeah,
that especially when you get to dyscalculia, all of a sudden we're using a math mechanic for it was like, oh man, oh, well, how do we do it? I don't know. We still haven't figured that one out yet. I don't know, but I don't know. We'll
yeah,
figure it out. But
absolutely.
it's a challenge.
It is a
All
challenge
right.
for sure.
So we'll have all your contact information in our show notes, but where's the one best place that you'd like people to start to learn more about you or to contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just realized that I don't know how many times I've said the name of my podcast. So my podcast is called Writing Alchemy. So you can find that in podcast catchers. Um, but yeah, so the number one place you can find me is my website, which is writingalchemy.net. And there's a resources tab, which has, it's getting so long because I
Mhm.
just keep making things, but there's a really long list in the resources tab. So you can find all sorts of things there, but also it has information about my podcasts and you can play episodes off the website. It has the current version of my game system, Magic Goes Awry. Um, and I post announcements there, links to all my social media, all the good stuff.
All right. And so thanks for coming on the show. And everyone, check out those links in the show notes.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
And also, when we have people available, we include a segment on the show called Playing the Other, where people with disabilities, neurodiversity, and mental illness come and talk about their experiences and how that relates to their gaming experiences and how they would like to see that represented in the gaming world. And so this is a chance for creators to tell us about some of the cool stuff they've made. And so if you'd like to be a guest on that segment, whether you're a creator or not, just want to share your experiences, we'd love to have you on. If you go to wormworkspublishing.com/contact, you can just fill out the form there and let us know, and I'll be in touch with you. So one of the other things I want to tell you about our Kickstarter is that one of the backer tiers, you get to assign your name to one of the magic items. It's like Keyword's Handy Haversack, but it's your name instead, or the name of someone who you have permission from to include. And so we've had people doing that to have their name immortalized in the book, and like parents doing it for their kids so their kids' name can show up in the book. And how cool would that be for the kids? It's just been really exciting to hear from people about that. Now, if you want to make sure that an item that's corresponding to your specific experience is available, now there's only so many items, so over 100, and possibly more depending how many people back us at that level. But if you want to make sure that an item that specifically connects with your experience is included in the book with your name on it, what you can also do is choose one of our create a character options. And then as you work with us to create a character, then you can design an item for that character and name it. And then that'll go in the book too, in addition to the item that you get to name, even if that one doesn't correspond to your experience. So again, if you're interested in that, jump over to inclusiverpg.com and just go there right now so you don't miss it. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter yet, you can go do that. We have dozens and dozens of 4K combat maps that are free, subclass also free, discounts, other specials, the latest news, blog posts, stuff that we can't include in the book because of licensing, and just the way that all this licensing stuff works. But we can do as blog posts and articles. Also, news about future projects. Just jump over to wormworkspublishing.com and sign up for our newsletter there. And then also we have a Patreon, and you can support our ongoing work because we have a lot more plans after this project. And that link for our Patreon is in the show notes. Or if you jump on our newsletter, we'll make sure to get that information to you. So if you see this being helpful, hit that like button if you're watching this on YouTube or somewhere else where you can do that. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe wherever it is most convenient for you to subscribe. If you know people that need to hear this, please pass it on to them. And if you, like me, think everyone needs to hear this because we get awesome guests on here, please pass it on to your social media friends. Don't forget those podcast ratings. It makes a huge difference to spread the word by increasing rankings in the algorithms. So please jump over to your favorite podcast area and leave a rating and possibly a review there too. So thanks everybody for your support. Thanks for watching and listening. And I close out with this question. How have role-playing games helped you learn more about experiences of people that are different from you?